The mountains did not welcome life so much as they tolerated it, the way they tolerated rot in fallen trees or the slow collapse of abandoned cabins. In the farthest Appalachian hollows, where sunlight arrived thin and hesitant, children were born who cried like newborns yet stared like the ancient. Their limbs moved, but not with purpose. Their eyes followed things no one else could see. Locals whispered they were alive only in halves, as if something essential had been misplaced during birth and never returned. These children did not arrive alone. Somewhere between the first labor pain and the final breath of relief, a woman always appeared. No one could say from which path she came or where she went afterward. She wore the same plain dress in every telling, its fabric darkened by age and something else that never washed clean. She never spoke first. She only watched the child, her expression heavy with recognition, like a midwife greeting an old mistake. Those who tried to chase her away paid dearly. Infants withered in their cribs, lungs filling as if drowning on dry land. Mothers woke to silence where breathing should have been. But families who let the woman stay, who allowed her to touch the child's brow and whisper words too old to understand, found their children lived. Lived, but never finished. They grew slowly, learning words out of order, smiling at grief, weeping at joy, their presence bending the air in rooms until conversation felt wrong. Graves multiplied on the hillsides, many too shallow, some unmarked, others never filled at all. Elders stopped keeping records. Ministers stopped asking questions. The hollow learned obedience. At night, when fog slid between the trees like a searching hand, people swore they could hear breathing from the ground itself, soft, patient, waiting. And in every house where a child stirred but never truly slept, there lingered the sense that something had been born alongside them, something that would not leave until it was whole again. The hollow did not earn its reputation all at once. It grew into it slowly, the way mold spreads across damp wood, unnoticed until it cannot be ignored. Tucked deep within the Appalachian spine, far from paved roads and reliable signals, it was a place where generations stayed because leaving felt heavier than staying. The land was fertile enough to survive on, but it carried an unspoken resistance to beginnings. Crops sprouted late, animals birthed weak offspring, and storms arrived without warning, as if the mountains themselves resented being disturbed. When the first child was born unfinished, the elders called it misfortune. When the second arrived the same way, they blamed bloodlines. By the fifth, no one spoke at all. The children were not stillborn, nor were they fully alive in any way people understood. Their chests rose and fell, their hearts beat strong enough to feel through thin skin, but something essential was absent. Some lacked strength in their limbs, others failed to respond to voices or touch, while a few stared endlessly into corners of rooms as though watching something pace just out of sight. They cried, but the sound carried no urgency, no demand, only a dull acknowledgement of existence. Mothers held them with devotion edged by terror, sensing that what they cradled was not meant to be this way. Doctors from outside the mountains rarely stayed long. They brought clean instruments and confident explanations that dissolved within days. Tests revealed nothing conclusive. Autopsies, when permitted, found organs intact and systems functioning, yet no explanation for the children's vacant awareness. The doctors eventually stopped coming. The midwives remained, though their hands trembled more with every birth. They began to speak of the hollow as if it were a living body rejecting its own offspring, allowing them to arrive only halfway into the world. Stories spread quietly, passed in murmurs between families who shared blood and fear. They said the hollow took something at birth, something unseen but vital, leaving the child suspended between arrival and completion. Some believed the mountains demanded payment for shelter. Others believed the land itself was wounded and could only create what mirrored its damage. The children grew, but not forward. They aged without progressing, learning just enough to survive but never enough to belong fully among the living. As years passed, the hollow became known beyond its borders, though never by name. Outsiders referred to it with euphemisms, if at all. Maps changed, roads rerouted, and deliveries stopped coming regularly. The people inside learned to live with the weight of unfinished lives breathing beside them, filling homes with a quiet wrongness that never lifted. Birth became an act of dread rather than hope, and every pregnancy carried the same unspoken question of what the hollow would choose to take this time. The rumors began as contradictions rather than stories, details that refused to agree with one another yet pointed toward the same unsettling figure. Some said she was old enough to have walked the mountains before the roads were carved through them, her back slightly bent as if shaped by centuries of watching births come and go. Others insisted she appeared young, her face smooth and unmarked, her eyes carrying the exhaustion of someone who had seen too much to be counted as mortal. What never changed was the timing of her arrival. She was seen only during births that went wrong, emerging in the narrow space between panic and acceptance, when a household realized something was not unfolding as it should. No one could say how she entered a home. Doors were found unlocked that had been bolted tight. Windows were discovered open despite the cold. A few swore she stepped directly out of the shadowed corners of rooms, condensing from darkness into human shape. She never announced herself. She did not knock. She was simply there, standing close enough to the mother to be felt before she was seen. The air seemed to settle when she arrived, heavy and still, as if the house itself had been instructed to listen. They called her the mother because no other word fit. She did not behave like a healer or a midwife, yet she touched newborns with familiarity, as though she had been waiting specifically for them. Her hands lingered on their foreheads, their chests, sometimes over their eyes, and the child would grow quiet beneath her touch. She whispered rarely, but when she did, the sounds were not words anyone recognized, more like fragments of a language remembered by the bones rather than the mind. Those who witnessed her struggled to describe her afterward. Features slipped away under scrutiny, details rearranging themselves with every retelling. Her dress was always described the same way, plain, dark, worn thin in places, but its age could never be agreed upon. She left no tracks outside the house, even in mud or snow. And before dawn, she was gone. No farewell, no explanation, no sign she had ever been there beyond the child left breathing in the cradle. The danger lay not in her presence but in resistance to it. Families who barred doors and shouted for her to leave reported the same outcome, the child weakening rapidly, breath growing shallow, eyes dulling as if something essential had been withdrawn. Those who allowed her to stay, who endured the quiet terror of watching her work without understanding, found their children survived the night. Survival came at a cost, but it was life nonetheless, and in the hollow, life of any kind was often enough. As these stories accumulated, belief hardened into ritual. Pregnant women were warned not to scream too loudly, not to curse the dark corners of the room, not to deny what might arrive with the child. Acceptance became a form of protection, and the mother, half feared and half needed, took her place in the hollow's unspoken laws, appearing only when called by unfinished life and leaving before the sun could expose her to judgment. The people who assisted at the births were the first to understand that witnessing the mother came with consequences. Midwives, doctors, and the few nurses who dared travel into the hollow carried the weight of knowledge no one else could fully grasp. They saw her up close, watched her hands move with certainty over infants that defied explanation, and felt the pressure in the room shift when she arrived. At first, they tried to speak openly about what they had seen, convinced that clarity might bring help or answers. Instead, their words seemed to mark them. The earliest deaths were dismissed as coincidence. A midwife collapsed on her way home, heart stopped without warning. A visiting doctor returned to the lowlands and was found days later in his office, seated upright, eyes open, expression frozen in quiet recognition. Another lost her sight overnight, waking to darkness that no physician could diagnose. Patterns emerged only after enough names were crossed out of informal records, after enough empty chairs appeared at church gatherings and kitchen tables. Those who survived longer learned to stay silent. They discovered that describing the mother in detail brought on a sickness that started as fatigue and ended in something worse. Speech itself seemed dangerous, as though naming her invited her attention back toward the speaker. Some developed tremors in their hands, making it impossible to assist in further births. Others began sleepwalking, found wandering toward the tree line in the dead of night, barefoot and unresponsive, as if answering a call they could not hear while awake. Doctors from outside the region fared no better. A few dismissed local warnings and insisted on professional obligation. They arrived with authority and equipment, confident that superstition would yield to diagnosis. Those who encountered the mother directly often left the hollow shaken, abandoning their notes and refusing to return phone calls. Some vanished entirely between towns, their cars found empty along mountain roads. Others lived, but carried the encounter like a slow-burning wound, dying months later of unexplained failures that left no trace on their bodies. The Hollow learned from these losses. Midwives began to retire early, claiming arthritis or poor eyesight, though everyone knew fear was the true cause. Births became quieter affairs, attended only by those who had never seen the mother and prayed never to. When asked about her, older midwives stared past the questioner, their faces tightening as if holding something back behind their teeth. They passed down instructions instead of explanations, rules without reasons. Silence became a form of survival. The fewer words spoken about her, the longer people lived. The Hollow accepted that some knowledge demanded payment in years, and some sights shortened the future of those who witnessed them. By the time the pattern was undeniable, no one with first-hand knowledge was willing to confirm it aloud, and the mother continued to arrive unchallenged, surrounded by a growing absence of those who had once tried to understand her. The choice families faced was never spoken of openly, yet everyone understood it the moment a birth began to go wrong. When labor stretched too long, when the cries of the newborn sounded thin or strangely distant, the house seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see which path the parents would take. Some reacted with fear sharpened into defiance, shouting prayers, barricading doors, clutching the child as if strength alone could force wholeness into fragile flesh. Others, exhausted and terrified, recognized the signs and surrendered to a quiet, dreadful acceptance before the mother ever appeared. Those who rejected her presence often believed love would be enough. They kept lamps burning through the night, sang to their children, begged doctors by radio or messenger to come quickly. For a few hours, sometimes even a day, hope lingered. Then the decline began. Breathing grew wet and uneven, as though the lungs were filling with something unseen. Skin cooled despite blankets. Eyes lost focus, drifting away from faces meant to anchor them. The child's death rarely came violently, it arrived with an unbearable gentleness, slipping away while parents still believed there was time left to save them. Families who allowed the mother to remain experienced a different kind of terror. She never forced her way in, but her presence demanded consent of a sort deeper than words. Once accepted, she moved with purpose, touching the child and murmuring sounds that unsettled everyone who heard them. The room grew still, the air thick, and the newborn quieted. By morning, the child lived. Their hearts beat strong, their breath steady, their eyes open. Relief washed over the family, followed almost immediately by the realization that survival had not restored what was missing. These children lingered between states. They ate and slept, learned to walk eventually, but always with hesitation, as if testing whether gravity would continue to hold them. Their reactions came seconds too late, their laughter out of rhythm, their understanding fractured. They frightened animals and unsettled visitors, who complained of headaches or nausea after spending too long near them. Parents learned to recognize the emptiness in their children's gaze, the way it slipped past faces and fixed on spaces no one else could see. Grief did not end with survival. It merely changed shape. Families mourned children who lived beside them, who grew older without truly arriving. Yet they also knew that without the mother, those children would not have lived at all. This knowledge bound families into quiet compliance. They did not speak of fairness or morality, they spoke of outcomes. Life, even incomplete, became preferable to loss, and the Hollow adjusted its values accordingly. Over time, the pattern hardened into law. Acceptance ensured breathing bodies and years of presence. Rejection led only to small graves and unanswered questions. Parents learned to weigh their fear against their love, knowing the choice would define not only their child's fate but the way the Hollow would remember them. In this way, the mother secured her place not through force, but through consequence, and each family that chose survival, however altered, strengthened the cycle that kept her returning. As the years folded into decades, the Hollow began to thin in ways that were not immediately visible. Families stopped inviting outsiders in, then stopped sending their children out. Marriages were arranged within a narrowing circle of surnames, and those who did leave rarely returned, cutting themselves cleanly from the place rather than risking the pull that always seemed to drag people back. The road leading into the Hollow fell into disrepair, its maintenance quietly removed from county plans, its absence justified by low population and lack of economic value. The reputation of the place spread unevenly, carried more by silence than by story. Officials avoided it without admitting why. Census workers marked houses as abandoned that were clearly lived in. Birth records were filed late or not at all, and death certificates listed vague causes or none. Over time, entire generations existed only in memory, their names never written into books meant to preserve them. Maps were redrawn, boundaries shifted, and the hollow became a blank space between labeled regions, a place people traveled around rather than through. Within the hollow, fear reshaped daily life. The unfinished children grew older, and their presence changed the rhythm of the community. Schools closed when attendance dropped too low, and parents began teaching at home, reluctant to expose their children to outsiders who might ask questions or react badly. Churches combined services, then stopped meeting altogether when sermons turned too often toward grief and unanswerable doubt. Burial grounds expanded quietly into wooded slopes, many graves unmarked to avoid drawing attention to how many children never reached adulthood. The outside world's retreat was mirrored by the hollow's withdrawal from it. Deliveries became infrequent, then ceased. Mail arrived months late or not at all. Electricity flickered unreliably, and when lines went down, repairs took so long that people learned to live without them. The hollow adapted, growing inward, depending on itself while becoming increasingly wary of anything unfamiliar. Stories about the mother were no longer shared with children, they were absorbed through observation and behavior, learned without being explained. Eventually, the hollow stopped appearing in official records altogether. Its absence was not dramatic, it happened through omission. A funding request denied here, a maintenance route altered there, until the place existed only on older maps and in the memories of those who had reason to remember. Outsiders who wandered too close felt an instinctive urge to turn back, uneasy without knowing why. The land itself seemed to discourage attention, paths fading quickly behind those who walked them. Isolation hardened into permanence. The hollow did not collapse or vanish, it persisted quietly, sustained by habit, fear, and the ongoing cycle of incomplete births. Cut off from scrutiny and assistance, the mother's presence became unquestioned, woven so deeply into the fabric of life that imagining a future without her felt as impossible as imagining the mountains without their shadows. In erasing itself from the world, the hollow ensured that what happened within it would continue unseen, uninterrupted, and unchallenged. The investigation began not with the hollow itself but with what was missing from the archives. Birth ledgers from several Appalachian counties showed gaps that could not be explained by migration or disaster. Entire years listed fewer births than deaths, an imbalance that grew more pronounced the farther back the records went. Hospital registries referenced transfers that never arrived, infants discharged without follow-up, and handwritten notes that ended abruptly, as if the writers had stopped mid-thought. To the narrator, trained to notice absence as much as presence, these omissions formed a shape too deliberate to ignore. Following that shape led them into back rooms of county offices and storage basements where dust lay thick over boxes no one remembered authorizing. Inside were partial records, midwife logs with pages torn out, death certificates stamped but never signed, baptismal entries without names. One recurring notation appeared in different hands across decades, a symbol resembling a half-circle, drawn beside certain entries, never explained. When asked about it, clerks grew uncomfortable, insisting the markings were old shorthand no longer used, though none could say what it meant. Graveyards offered the next clues. In several mountain cemeteries, rows of stones ended abruptly, giving way to empty stretches of ground where the earth was disturbed but unmarked. Some plots were too small for adults yet too numerous to be accidental. Ground-penetrating surveys were denied, permits delayed indefinitely. Locals watched from a distance, faces closed, their silence louder than any protest. The narrator began to sense that the land itself resisted being questioned, that every attempt to clarify was met with bureaucratic fog or quiet hostility. The trail narrowed toward the hollow. Maps conflicted. GPS signals failed without warning. Roads shifted from pavement to gravel to rutted dirt without clear transitions. The closer the narrator drew, the more the surrounding towns grew evasive. Shopkeepers claimed ignorance of nearby settlements that clearly existed. Gas station attendants advised turning back, citing weather or wildlife that did not match the season. No one would give directions past a certain point. What finally confirmed the narrator's suspicions was a set of photographs tucked inside an old midwife's journal. The images showed children of varying ages, their faces oddly still, their expressions mismatched with their bodies. Each photograph was labeled only with a date and the same half-circle symbol found in the records. The last page of the journal contained a single sentence written repeatedly until the ink tore the paper: "She will not let them be finished." Armed with fragments and unanswered questions, the narrator pressed on, driven by the need to see the place where records failed and memory fractured. The investigation was no longer academic. It had become personal, shaped by the growing realization that something had been allowed to persist simply because no one outside the hollow was willing to look closely enough, and that by stepping toward it, the narrator was crossing into a space that had been carefully hidden not to protect the world from it, but to protect it from the world. The discovery came by accident, in a place that should have offered closure rather than revelation. While tracing the edges of the hollow, the narrator followed an overgrown footpath that ended in a stand of trees older than the surrounding forest, their roots knotted above ground like exposed veins. Beneath them lay a scattering of low mounds, barely distinguishable from the natural rise and fall of the land. There were no stones, no names, only the faint suggestion that the earth had been disturbed and then carefully returned to stillness. At first, the narrator assumed the graves were old and empty, the remnants of a community too poor or frightened to mark its dead. But the instruments told a different story. Subtle movements registered beneath the soil, irregular yet deliberate, too slow to be animals and too shallow to be dismissed. When the first mound was uncovered, the truth revealed itself not through sight alone but through sound. A breath escaped the exposed earth, shallow and hoarse, as though the ground itself were alive and struggling. The bodies beneath were not corpses. Their skin bore the pallor of long darkness, but it was warm to the touch. Their chests rose and fell with labored rhythm, and their eyes, when light reached them, fluttered open in confusion rather than death. These were the children who had never truly died, the ones the hollow claimed had been buried after sickness or accident. They had been placed underground while still breathing, sealed away not as punishment, but as preservation. The narrator pieced together what the families had never spoken aloud. The half-alive children did not age normally. Their bodies matured slowly, unevenly, sometimes stopping altogether. When they became too unsettling to keep in the home, when their presence drew unwanted attention or their behaviors grew difficult to manage, they were not killed. They were returned to the earth, entrusted to the land that had taken part of them at birth. Burial became another form of waiting. The soil in the hollow was different, rich and heavy, insulating sound and slowing decay. It allowed the incomplete bodies to persist in a suspended state, breathing just enough to remain tethered to life. Roots curled around them without piercing skin. Moisture fed them sparingly. The mountain itself seemed to cradle what it had helped create, hiding them from time rather than ending them. This revelation reframed every disappearance, every unmarked grave, every missing record. The hollow had not simply lost its children. It had stored them. The incomplete were never meant to move forward into the world, they were meant to remain where the boundary between life and death was thin enough to sustain them indefinitely. Standing among the shallow graves, the narrator understood that what had been uncovered was not an atrocity born of cruelty, but a system born of accommodation. The hollow had learned how to manage what it could not undo, choosing concealment over destruction, and in doing so had created a population that existed beneath the surface, breathing in darkness, waiting for something none of them had ever been able to name. The deeper truth of the mother revealed itself slowly, in fragments that the narrator could piece together only through observation, whispered accounts, and patterns too consistent to dismiss. The children were incomplete in ways that went beyond the physical or mental. Their half-alive state was not merely a flaw of biology, but a tether to something far older, something that had existed long before the hollow had been named. The mother, the figure who appeared at every troubled birth, was not human in the sense that anyone could fully comprehend. She was a vessel, a conduit between the world of the living and a hidden force embedded in the land itself. Signs of this connection were subtle at first. When she touched the newborns, shadows seemed to bend unnaturally around her hands, clinging to the infants for a moment longer than light allowed. Animals recoiled or refused to enter rooms where she lingered, and water in bowls would ripple without wind. Families noted that objects shifted slightly after she passed through, as if the air itself remembered her movements. Even the children, those half-alive creatures, seemed to respond to something she carried but never named. They quieted in her presence, drew warmth from her touch, and followed her gaze to spaces no one else could see. The narrator realized that this tether was not passive. Every child born incomplete was bound to her in a way that exceeded nurture or guidance. It was a binding that ensured survival at a cost. The child's wholeness, the potential to exist fully in the world, was sacrificed to maintain the link. She absorbed some portion of what should have been theirs, holding it between herself and the land. It was this exchange that allowed them to breathe and move, yet remain half alive, suspended between life as humans understood it and the strange, enduring presence the mother carried. The pattern repeated over generations. The hollow itself seemed aware, an active participant in the cycle, shaping its terrain to protect and conceal the half-alive. Graves were shallow but fertile, rivers curved around them without flooding, trees grew dense over burial sites, shielding them from sight and sky. Each generation of children tethered to the mother reinforced the hidden order. What she carried, what she bound, could not be fully released without catastrophe. The incompleteness of life in the hollow was maintained deliberately, an equilibrium of survival and deprivation orchestrated by a force both living and elemental. The narrator began to perceive the impossibility of separating the mother from the hollow, or from the children themselves. She was not merely a figure who intervened, she was the linchpin of the hollow's unnatural balance, the living conduit of its deepest secret. Without her, the half-alive could not persist. Yet with her, they would never be whole. The revelation settled into the narrator with a weight that felt physical, pressing at the chest and hollowing out certainty, leaving only the inescapable truth that the mother's existence was both mercy and imprisonment, and that understanding her meant acknowledging the incompleteness she carried as both gift and curse. The truth of the mother's origin was the sort of revelation that unsettled the ground beneath one's feet even before it reached the mind. As the narrator traced the threads of history through midwife journals, unmarked graves, and whispered family stories, a pattern began to emerge that made all the half-alive children in the hollow part of a single, long lineage. The mother had not always been a figure summoned at births. She had been the first of the incomplete, born long ago in the same hollow, her own arrival marked by the same abnormalities and whispered terror that would follow her descendants. Her body had grown, but in ways that defied natural progression. Time touched her differently. Her hair grayed unevenly, her skin wrinkled and stretched as though life were trying to press forward, yet she never fully aged or decayed. No one recorded her name, though some ancient journals hinted at it, scrawled in hands too shaky to read clearly. She was referred to instead by descriptors: the waiting, the shadow, the one who watches. Her parents had died young or disappeared, leaving her to be raised by the hollow itself, its forests and creeks shaping her instincts as much as any human teacher could. From the beginning, she had been attuned to the strange pulse of the incomplete life surrounding her. She understood intuitively what no one else could articulate, that the children born half alive could not survive without her presence, and that survival required a tether stronger than love or medicine. As she matured, the mother became both caretaker and vessel, absorbing the energy of each successive generation of children who arrived unfinished. With each birth she attended, a part of her own existence intertwined more tightly with the hollow, until she was inseparable from it. She no longer merely appeared, she belonged. The air shifted when she entered a room, the trees seemed to lean closer, and even the ground beneath her steps carried a quiet resonance, as if recognizing her authority over what had once been her own incomplete self. Understanding this, the narrator realized that the mother's immortality was not merely longevity. It was continuity. She was the living archive of the hollow's unnatural lineage, the firstborn incomplete and now the guardian, the conduit, and the arbiter of all who followed. Her hands carried both the memory and the requirement of every half-alive child, and her presence ensured that the cycle would continue without interruption. She existed because the hollow had demanded it, because the children had demanded it, and because the land itself would not release her. In this light, the mother was no longer simply a mysterious figure arriving at births. She was the origin, the seed, and the container of the Hollow's most unsettling truth, a truth that tethered life and death together in a loop that stretched back farther than anyone dared calculate. The narrator's investigation reached its most unsettling moment when it became clear that the Hollow had already begun to extend its choice toward a new cycle. Patterns emerged in the births they recorded, subtle but undeniable. The children born in the past year exhibited signs that were more extreme, more deliberate than those the narrator had seen before. Limbs that failed to bend properly, eyes that lingered too long on empty corners, the faint rhythm of shallow breathing that seemed out of sync with the world around them all pointed to a child who was not merely incomplete, but chosen. The Hollow did not allow chance to dictate its course, it selected carefully, and the selection bore weight beyond the family's understanding. When the narrator first glimpsed the new mother, a woman who had recently given birth in one of the deeper valleys, a sense of inevitability pressed on them like the weight of the mountains themselves. She was young, but her presence carried the same rigid stillness as the mother they had already glimpsed in accounts, the same uncanny patience that had allowed countless half-alive children to survive while remaining suspended. The way she held the newborn, the instinctive deference in her gestures, suggested that she had already been drawn into the Hollow's designs. The child's fragile breaths did not falter when the woman approached, and the air around them seemed to tremble in recognition. Signs in the surrounding community reinforced the notion that this was no ordinary birth. Elders watched quietly, faces drawn tight with apprehension. Midwives who had retired years ago returned briefly, trembling as they observed the proceedings, their hands shaking though unused to labor. Dogs refused to enter the room, and even the wind seemed to shift direction, carrying the Hollow's silent judgment. The narrator began to understand that the mother's role was not static, it was cyclical, and the Hollow demanded succession to maintain its balance. The child itself, though barely more than a wisp of life, bore the marks of the Hollow's will. There was a subtle symmetry in its incompleteness, a pattern repeated from generation to generation, as if the mountain itself had shaped the tiny body to mirror its own fractures. The narrator saw, with a dawning horror, that the Hollow had already extended the invisible tether to this newborn, preparing the way for a continuation of what had always been. In witnessing these events, the narrator realized the impossibility of intervention. This selection was neither random nor negotiable. The Hollow had chosen, and through its selection, the cycle of half-alive existence would persist. The mother's work, carried over centuries, was already being passed forward. Understanding this brought clarity, but also an oppressive weight. The Hollow did not ask permission, it only accepted compliance. The narrator felt, with a cold certainty, that the new mother had already been marked, and that the Hollow's choice was irreversible, woven into the fabric of the land and the generations it would continue to hold suspended between life and something else entirely.